protests in Great Britain. So there were street protests in Great Britain of working men and others who were pro-American. Let the American go, American, independence for us, independence for the Americans too. And of course, Great Britain found itself increasingly divided over this issue. And when finally came the Battle of Yorktown, which was just one more, extraordinary thorn in the side of the British cause, Parliament will just see the writing on the wall. They're not going to be able to win this. It's just going to go on and on and on, of course, with no particular victory in sight, no exit plan available. And so that will lead them to the negotiations, of course, that will ultimately bring about the peace of the Treaty of Paris. So, why did the British lose, even though they were so powerful? You can look to what happened to the Americans in Vietnam. You can begin to see kind of, a similar situation. Now, here's another interesting question. So, this is the question historians pay attention to more than average people would. Should this be called a revolution? The concept of revolution, of course, is something that evolves in the modern world. Societies that begin to change in incredible kind of ways. There's an interesting issue about revolution. Is revolution creating the change, or is revolution simply manifesting the change? The changes that have already been have already taken place. Are they just becoming, taking over essentially? Anyway, when we look from the European perspective, the global perspective on revolution, of course, we see the extraordinary nature of the French Revolution, massive social political revolution. Basically the overthrow of a government, a monarchy, overthrow of a class, the aristocracy, the establishment ultimately of a republic, the establishment of the bourgeoisie as the dominant element. So powerful revolutionary activity transforming the nature of France, of course, with impacts that radiate around the world. We will later see the Russian Revolution, again, of course, transformation of social, political, economic to some degree, overthrowing the Tsarist regime, establishing really what was pretty much a very authoritarian, powerful Bolshevik regime. Again, overthrowing kind of, in this case, the idea was to overthrow the bourgeoisie and institute the proletariat. It's a really difficult, a whole bunch of issues there that don't quite fit exactly, but to some degree. But we see the violence and transformation associated with the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, of course. In this case, actually overthrowing kind of a bourgeois nationalist government and instituting a proletarian communist, but not, nothing ever works perfectly. In China, the vast majority of the people were peasants, so they're not really the industrial proletariat, but still rising up to overthrow, of course, and huge changes kind of as a result of that. Though some people look at that and say, well, was it really, you go from having the Tsarist regime that's, has this very powerful hold on everybody to a Soviet regime that has this, that kind of thing, or you go from having, you don't really have the emperor at that time, but you go to having Mao, which of course is kind of like he was his own sort of communist empire, emperor controlling over communist China. Those things don't work perfectly. But the question is, when we compare those revolutions with their violence, with the transforming nature of these revolutions, does the American story fit into the situation? In some ways you could think, that it doesn't. There are some people who think that we should really not call it the American Revolution, but instead we should call it the American War for Independence, because there's kind of like a reactionary situation for the revolution. The Americans aren't fighting to transform to go somewhere else. They're actually fighting to have what they've already, to keep what they had. They've had relative independence, they have representative government, they have basic self-rule, and what they didn't like were the British interfering with this, so they're trying to just fight against the British to get back to where they were, their own sense of self-rule, their own self-domination, okay? So that's not revolutionary, that's not going forward, we could call that reactionary. They're trying to maintain what they've already had, essentially. There are some also who reflect upon, like our flag, as a symbol of, the lack of a revolutionary dynamic. When the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, or even the French Revolution to some degree, you bring out a whole new flag, and of course, ultimately, red, the color of blood, the color of change, that becomes sort of the flag of revolution. Well, the Americans basically took the British flag, at least in all of the colors, So the British flag, Union Jack, is red, white, and blue. The American flag is red, white, and blue. And of course, we realigned everything to the stars and stripes and all those things that would be part of the American flag. But it's interesting, the Americans did not necessarily want to divorce themselves with everything that there was with their associations with Great Britain. So the question is, was it a revolution? And as I've already told you, there's some people who say no. It is more the war of independence than it is a revolution. But there is something revolutionary about the American Revolution. So it's not, we don't want to dismiss the concept absolutely. The primary, and it was subtle, there's no doubt about that. The primary concept that we focus on is the issue of equality. You had a deferential society in America. There was an elite that dominated the society in a gentle way, as I told you, but they still dominated. And here comes the Declaration of Independence. Here comes that powerful statement recognizing that all men are created equal. And then, of course, you have the revolutionary activities and it really did have an impact upon Americans. The average American, comes out of the revolution believing in the general notion of human equality, that human beings are equal, at least in terms of before the law and equality of opportunity, if not necessarily equality of condition. So there is really kind of, it's meaningful. So before the war, you would have had like a lower class person who would have walked up to an elite member of the elite, and as they approach them, they take their hat off and they kind of bow down or something like that, just to show that they recognize the relative domination of the elite. Well, after this Revolutionary War, you don't do that. You walk up to George Washington, hey, George, how you doing? You're going to shake hands with George because you are an American citizen and he is an American citizen and he has no specific reason why he should be in a superior position to you. So it's a subtle kind of issue, but it is meaningful as the Americans began to embrace the general notion of equality. I did tell you that one of the primary political cultural value of colonial America was liberty. Well, the revolution will introduce the idea of equality. And the intriguing part of that is that the two of them don't always work exactly well together. Liberty is often perceived more as kind of the conservative value, that every individual should be able to do what they want to do. And equality is more like the general value, the social value, that people should have equal rights and people should have equal access to medical care or relative economic justice and those kind of things. So, and yet these two become, even though they don't always work necessarily perfectly together, two primary values as far as the American political culture is concerned. So, is there a revolution? It's subtle, basically, but it's meaningful as the Americans really embrace the concept of evolution as they begin to move forward. Okay? All right. My last little thing I want to do here, okay, so if it is a revolution, who is it for? For whom is this revolution? And I do want us to understand, of course, sort of the nature of the game in the very beginning. The revolution was basically for white men. This is not a revolution for everyone. This is a revolution for white men. They were the ones who were perceived as being part of the inclusive entity. They were the ones for whom equality is being extended. And at the same time, of course, that means that they're those that are being excluded. So I just wanted to mention, for instance, like what's going to happen to slavery. The revolution really questioned slavery. There's no doubt about that. Here are all these Americans who are fighting for their liberty, right? And ultimately promoting the notion of equality. And yet here they are holding people in bondage, enslaving them, depriving of their liberty, treating them like essential chattel property. Anyway, there was at least a powerful challenge that came down as the revolution begins to take place. And I do want you to know this. There's a challenge to slavery, and it did lead to the greatest emancipation of slaves before the great emancipation that ends the Civil War. We believe that around 200,000 slaves were emancipated during the Revolutionary period. And they were emancipated for a variety of different reasons in different situations. In some cases, it was the slave owners themselves who felt the contradictory nature of slavery, the problem. I mean, how could they, as a human being, of course, on the one hand, be fighting for their liberty, while on the other hand, they're depriving it for these people. And for some of these slaveholders, their conscience got the best of them, basically, and they would emancipate their slaves. Some slaves were liberated by their action. Some of them will serve in the Continental Army. There are about 5,000 African Americans who served in the American Army during the Civil War. So that means that they are a critical part of the fighting force. And I really do appreciate when they show a movie or something like that where you see that some of the soldiers are indeed African American. And for that, for those that did this, they were offered their freedom. It was a way you could be a slave to you could be a free person. I did tell you some slaves emancipated themselves by going over to the British side, so that became part of them. But some of them took their own freedom. They simply made a decision, that this is not right, and they would run away. There was a lot of chaos during the Revolution, and so it gave an opportunity for individuals who would just simply run away. So you have this one moment where there's really questioning, and of course it will lead to actual emancipation. About 200,000 slaves will be emancipated during the Civil War. But here's during the American Revolution. But here's the critical kind of thing I want you to know. There's a questioning of slavery. Is it right? Should we have it? Okay. In the South, they questioned it. You see people like, Thomas Jefferson sort of endlessly questioning it. But the ultimate answer for the Southerners was, we need this. This is the essence of our economy. It supports our society. It supports our political apparatus. So the Southerners are basically committed to slavery, even in the aftermath of the American Revolution. But the Northerners say, we don't need it, you know. And so you see the northern states beginning to move away from slavery in the aftermath of the American Revolution. By 1810, every single northern state had gotten rid of slavery, abolished it one way or the other. In some cases, they did grandfather it out. So that means that there were still slaves who lived in the north. These would have been owned by people before 1910, and the law simply allowed them to continue owning that slave, but of course no other slaves or anything like that. So you have these few kind of interesting incidental situations where there are some slaves who lived in the north well into the antebellum period. But for all intents and purposes, the North says, no, we don't want slavery. So what the American Revolution does is it questions slavery. That's critical. But more importantly, it divides the nation. It's almost like you're choosing up sides for the Civil War. The North says no to slavery, and the South, of course, says, we're going to maintain this, and it creates the foundation of ultimate conflict. In the question of for whom, I also want to talk about women just for a moment here, okay? This was a revolution for white men, and of course women are also going to be part of the element that is being excluded in this regard. I want you to know that women were critical in the American Revolution, sustaining the home front, sustaining the farms, the houses, the families of those who fought. They would often do much more than that, though. They would sew the clothing that was needed. They would put together the bandages. Women would spend lots of time making musket balls and things like that, and the little cartridges that they would need to shoot those. There were some women who acted as couriers and even spies. So this is where sexism, you can play sexism against itself kind of. So a woman walking down the road with a market basket on her arm was perceived as being no significant threat to the redcoats. And yet that woman might be carrying all kinds of really important information. So there were women who indeed were couriers, who were spies and provided really essential information, especially for the American cause. There were some women who actually did engage in the battle. They would go and fight. Some of them just went to support their husband, and their stories are like the woman who's just loading the muskets for her husband as he's trying to fire. There were some women who apparently put their hair up under their hat and they actually went into battle themselves, So there were women who did critical part, important part, of course, of any situation, any time, but also very important in sustaining the American effort in terms of the American Revolution. And yet, when the revolution takes place, what does Thomas Jefferson say? All men are created